Good morning and welcome to our lecture series in Introduction to Psychology. This is our first topic in the general psychology section dealing with perception. So let's start by reviewing what you need to read, and these are our readings from our course book, but I also highlighted keywords as usual, and they're given to you based on how they appear in the chapter. So first, consciousness, then sensation, it's another chapter, and perception. So these are from three main chapters in the book. I also give you some further readings, another part which is not obligatory to read, of course, from the Atkinson book, yet it's fascinating, the perceptual development part. And there's an article on signal detection, usually not the favorite psychophysiological topic of students, but this is an easy to read yet fascinating article. So consciousness first. What is consciousness? Let's start by giving you some definitions, and it's a quote from the book that there are almost as many theories of consciousness as people who work with this topic. First of all, we have to understand that it's both a monitoring task and a controlling task. We monitor ourselves, being aware of the fact that we are here, we're aware, but we also have to control our thoughts. Who hasn't had the problem of his or her thoughts just slipping away, or you were driving and you were thinking about something and the road might disappear. So these are all states where consciousness might alter from its original or general way of how it's functioning. So probably it's a good idea to talk about consciousness and understand it considering its absence. So we're introducing the terms unconscious and this altered state of consciousness, which could vary from sleeping and dreaming or daydreaming to giving birth or being in hypnosis or having some influence of drugs or alcohol or other things. And I'm giving you a video example here starring Michael Stephen Anthony Graziano, who is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Princeton University. He's a remarkable speaker and an avid practitioner of ventriculism and uses this puppet Kevin as a sidekick. He is not using it in this specific video, but if you might want to check out his other videos on YouTube, he's a fascinating speaker. So you need to stop this video right here, listen to the TED Talk by Graziano, and then come back for more. It's in the links under this video where you have to click now. So I think that this video clearly explains how the neural basis can serve as an insight for understanding awareness and consciousness. And keep in mind that in some severe cases of multiple personality, again, an example from the clinical cases, can also reveal some important knowledge about what is consciousness. But let's leave it there because although it's a full chapter, this is all that we need for this specific topic. And let's continue by the sensory processes in chapter 4. In this chapter, we will talk about all the senses. So you have vision, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, including pain and some very small pressure and other sensory feelings. But we will for the introductory psychology course, stay on the surface explaining what is common in these different sensory processes. So we will talk about threshold sensitivity, the threshold sensation, and the signal detection theory. And later chapter parts will not be discussed in this lecture. Okay, so we will not cover all the details of vision, audition, and other senses. For a moment, just think that you're on a beach, taking a deep breath with those salty smell, feeling the sand under your feet, and at some point somewhere in the background of the whole vision area that you're looking, you can spot a fin. Is it a shark? No, definitely not. It's a dolphin. So from something is moving in the water sensation, a fundamental raw experience associated with the stimuli, you arrive at an actual perception. Dolphins or some funny animals that I know that, I don't have to fear. You have a meaningful interpretation of that sensory stimuli. This is what we will cover in this lecture, how we go from sensation to perception, first dealing with the sensation part, and then we go into the depth of perception. Nonetheless, right at the beginning, I will highlight this what we call back projections part, kind of your upper top processes, giving you a down insight on what these animals in the water could be. So it's important to understand that it's not always from sensation to perception, so sort of bottom-up processes, but also top-down processes help in this whole process. So let's begin by the minimum threshold of vision, and before going into the details, what do you see there in the back? Hopefully you see a candle light very far, and you can sense it really, really far away. The minimal threshold for vision is a candle in a window 30 miles away. That's a lot. This also reveals us to sensitivity. Basically, the threshold for seeing anything has to do with sensitivity. And it is different for the different senses, although it's we are very sensitive to these different things. A tick of a clock at 20 feet under quiet conditions, or just 1 teaspoon of sugar in 2 gallons of water. Perfume also, or a wing of a fly falling on our cheek from 1 centimeter. Okay, so these are interesting absolute thresholds, or what we call them. This is how we detect these minimum intensities. Now, let me give you an example of how it's done in the laboratory. So this is a typical setup with visionary stimuli, and the subjects are given various strength of, for example, light, and they have to respond whether they see it or they don't. So when the subject responds with yes, but not once, but for a certain degree of stimuli in 50% of the time, then we point to that stimulus intensity and say that that's our threshold intensity. So it's a quite straightforward thing how to measure it, but sometimes we're not interested in whether we can see a barely seeable light, we're interested in how many more candles would I have to light up 30 miles away if I wanted to see the difference. So our second task, after detecting the absolute threshold values, is detecting changes in intensity. Let's see how that's done. So for example, let's say I had 12 candles lit already. Obviously in the window, if I light one more candle, you will see it. But what if there were 12 candles already there? Would you see one more candle? What do you think? Well, it's a definite yes. You would see it. That single candle lit along the 12 already existing candles. Okay, next question. What if there were 60 candles already lit? Would you see another candle lighting up? Well, no, you wouldn't. Okay, then how much should it be? And I call upon your mathematical background in determining this. Would 3 be enough? What do you feel or calculate? No, 3 is not enough. You would need at least 5 more candles lit to see the difference. So what is this? It's a simple percentage. It's a fraction. 12 to 1 equals 60 to 5. Easy as that. And we call this difference threshold, our minimum of when we actually can detect intensity changes. And there's also a much more obvious name for this, just noticeable difference. That's pretty straightforward. And it's there in percentage. So for light intensity, that's 8%, what we just said, the 60 to 5 or 12 to 1 is 8%. We also call this the Weber fraction, and it's different for each sensory sensation. For example, notice salt concentration, you need a 20% increase in order to actually feel that that soup is now saltier than it was before. So that was our light example. And let's turn to something else, which is quite interesting. How is it, before giving you the people who worked with this and the actual function, which you might not like that much, but let's give you an everyday example. If you're thinking about baby crying, okay, you're not having a baby just now, you're just, listening baby crying. Usually, the louder it gets, the less, interesting and annoying it might seem. So you get used to it, basically. It's kind of easier to get used to as electrical shocks. The more intensive shocks you're getting, I bet you're not going to get used to this. Now, why is that? Because as many very intrigued researchers have found, first Weber and Fechner, later Stanley Smith-Stevens, almost 100 years later, they have found this interesting equation that stimulus intensities and psychological sensations have this very specific way of relation. And this relation is best explained in what we call today Stevens' law. By the way, Weber and Fechner worked together, and Fechner had published many of Weber's results, but they were working in the same laboratory. In fact, Fechner was a student of Weber. And Stevens took all these informations and worked more on this later, like 100 years later. So his law is what we call the power is a power function law. The psychological sensation equals the stimulus intensity with this exponent. And here comes the interesting part, because if this R exponent is higher than 1, such as in electric shocks, then the more intense the stimuli gets, the more response, the more vivid response you get, as opposed to what I was referring to as a baby crying, auditory stimuli. There you have a different R. The R is below 0.5, and thus this is a different shape for the curve. The higher the intensity gets, the lower, relatively lower, the response will be. So please learn this. Stevens' law is very important in psychophysiology, and it explains a lot about sensations. So the arrows here represent for you that you get a concave down curve for the exponent under 1, and the concave up curve if your exponent is over 1. Let's talk about something a little bit different, signal plus noise, because so far we have only considered the facts when you had a signal and you had a response. But in reality, it happens many times that you don't have a signal. So we have a signal absent version of the story as well. And this is all collected in the so-called signal detection theory, where we have a theory that the sensory and decision processes involved in these psychophysical judgments have a specific reference to whether there are signal and noise. So let's see these 4 possibilities. If the signal is present and you say yes, you hit. Good. If the signal is absent and you say no, you're good. But there are the 2 other versions. Miss is pretty obvious, you missed it. But sometimes you just say, oh, but I've seen it, believe me, for sure. And it can be a problem if your false alarm, for example, involves, let's say, a serious misjudgment of a doctor based on some x-ray. Okay, so there are plenty of examples. Please read in the book for this. I wanted to highlight some important keywords. So for example, detection is there only in signal detection, according to signal detection theory, if the hit rate actually exceeds the false alarm rate. Okay, and a closely related term, sensitivity, which tells us how much the hit rate exceeds the false alarm rate. Also, we have expectation. That's a different story, because among other factors, expectation will influence what we call bias. If, for example, the observer expects the signal to be present more, for example, doctors are very, very sensitive to finding the problems, right? Because if they don't, then that's a jail issue. So they have a bias to respond yes, raising their false alarm rates. So these are important points to understand in signal detection theory. Let's move along a little further. So we have arrived to our next big topic, perception, how the sensory information is transformed into what actually we are aware as things happening to us. There are many different views of how this is done, some conflicting, And here on the introductory course, we will only highlight a few of these. So please read the book as a background reading. It's very important because you have wonderful stories there, for example, about the grizzly bear and the tent, which is an unexplainable which bear unexplainable similarities, and other interesting facts you will find in the book. Okay, but let's proceed. First, two important theories is one, the ecological optics theory related to James Jerome Gibson, as opposed to the model of environment. Gibson claimed that the sensory input hitting our visual and other sensory systems is perfectly enough to explain how we manage to solve ordinary problems and come across our general world. On the contrary, the model of the environment assumption or theory explains that we have to have some kind of schema or some kind of image in our heads, a good working model which can serve as to understand what's happening around us. So most people today believe that the second theory is more plausible, and throughout the rest of the lecture, I will build up what we call the basic functions of perception, and they are attention, localization, recognition, abstraction, and constancy. So we will talk about these 5 main functions along the way, and from whichever aspect you're looking at, you might see very different things, but the end result should be the same. So this is our first perceptual function, attention. And those of you who just know this video just by looking at the scene, then you can fast forward to the next slides. But those of you who haven't seen this scene before, I invite you to a test of selective attention. So let's stop for a moment. Please go to the links under this video, stop the video, do the selective attention test. Let's see what you experience and then come back. Let's see how we drive our attention towards, for example, the people with white shirts. Well, we direct our eye movements towards the interesting focus of our perception with fixations in between saccades. And please read this. This is a very good link I've given you on the YouTube details. Read this part. Okay, and maybe even do this test. Another interesting topic with auditory attention. This is a different sense, right? We've been talking about vision a lot, but we also have hearing, and in reality, these so attention shifts from different sensory focuses. So it can shift from auditory concentration to visual focus, and it's best described, this whole process is best described in a natural setting, which we call the cocktail party effect, where there's so many things going on visually and especially in hearing, yet if somebody were only to whisper your name in a conversation that you haven't been hearing anything from, only your name, you would, perceive that, and you would listen and, oh, they're talking about me. What are they talking about me? So that's a weird thing, and it has to do with attention. It's the explanation is that you're just like with the black gorilla and the white shirts, you're not focusing on everything, every sensory information that comes in the auditory, through the auditory channels. Yet you are getting it, you are sensing it. So if need be, if your name sounds, then you can focus your attention on that specific area. This is a specific skill that develops very early in childhood. There has been some studies showing that children as young as 12 months of age can hear their own names in this kind of setup. Shadowing technique in cognitive psychology and selective listening are some interesting further experiments and features that you might want to read in the course book. So let's move a little bit further on these very specific figures, and you might have seen especially these one, or what do you see? That's the general question. You might see a vase, yet you might see two faces facing each other, here and here. So it has all about these illusions or specific visual stimuli are conveying this figure versus ground phenomena. The object of interest will always appear more solid than the ground, and it will appear in front of it. The interesting part is you can change these, the way you see these pictures. So this one, as well as specifically this one, you can see either the figure or the ground. So you can see the black or the white as figures. You cannot see both at the same time. It's a good thing to try. There's some other examples. What do you see here? Is the woman old or young? You've probably come across, it's a very famous picture, and here is the nose if the woman is an old one, and here is the nose and it's facing backwards if it's a young one. So again, double sides. Or this is also an interesting one, although very different with the change of face profiles, or the specific historic one where you can see again two reeds, a man, which is probably the more obvious, and then the girl and the old man, and the dog being either a dog or a hand of the old man, of the big bald man. Okay, so this all takes us to Gestalt psychology and perceptual organization, basically how we transform our sensory input into actual perception, has several rules according to this Gestalt psychology theories. So obviously these pictures have shown that you will make a difference between figure and background. So that's one important feature, okay? And these were the examples, but there is another issue, and there are certain determinants of how you group dot patterns, okay? So please just look at this dot pattern and tell me, what do you see? I give you a little time to think. You can also pause the recording. And what do you see? Well, hopefully you see nothing, okay? This was a trick question. But if the dots are assembled in certain ways, so if they're not like this, totally equal differences, etc., if there's some, order to how they're assembled, then you recognize them as patterns. And these baselines or these kinds of dot patterns, there's the proximity rule, there's also similarity, and try to attach these notions to these figures. There's the good continuation and closure. So what do you think? Which could be which? Which is proximity? Basically, things that are closer are perceived as one, as a single line. So here, in this example, we have similarity, okay? These are good examples. And we have proximity, where we don't have these similar patterns, but we do have proximity, so we perceive these as dotted lines instead of just dots, just like the green picture I showed you. Here, we can also say that these black rows of dots are similar as compared to the gray ones, etc., etc. What could be closure and this good continuation? Well, it's probably very straightforward. Closure and good continuation are also important Gestalt determinants. Let's see something else. How do we perceive? So here we had an idea of how we perceive the actual things that we're looking at. But how can we tell whether they are close up or further apart? And binocular cues involving both of our eyes, as opposed to monocular cues that we will come to in a moment, help us to perceive distance. So basically, the retinal pictures of an object has a slight difference in the two eyes. And this difference is calculated in our heads and thus makes us perceive depth or distance. Okay, so this is called binocular disparity. Okay, an important cue in perceiving depth. But we also have, as I said, monocular cues. What are they? They're very straightforward on this picture. How do we know that these bicyclists are further than, let's see, this lamp post? Well, let's see them one by one. We have relative size. The lamp posts are becoming smaller and smaller. We have interposition. Basically, this house roof is covering the other one. We have relative height, so how high these chimneys are. We have perspective, roads going together, road sides, and we might not see it or might not realize it, but shading and shadows are really important in perceiving distance or depth. So our last topic in this area is how do we, now we know what things are and where they are, but how do they move? How do we perceive that they're moving? How do we perceive motion? So there's some very straightforward answers if the motion is relative. So you have a solid background and you see a runner in front of the background, then the actual movements in front of, I'm doing that now, in front of the black background, this movement is obviously motion. What if this doesn't happen? We can also have something that we call stroboscopic motion. Well, we have a successful presentation of a stimuli corresponding to movement, although there's no real movement. Let us see this in this video, although I'm sure you know this easy demonstration. So there's no real movement, there's only pages, and of course the pages move, but the dots don't. They stay on the pages, right? So obviously this is used in movies where you have a string of pictures with slightly different aspects of the original figure. We have also something that's called selective adaptation. And if we see a movement for a certain time, our sensory system will adapt to this movement, and when it changes or it stops, then we have this sensation which doesn't exist anymore. Only our retinas are fooling ourselves. Let's see how this looks like. Fixate on the blue X. Ooh. Some more. And the bug is really approaching you. And interestingly, okay, I'm getting nauseous now. When you see the video, for example, this next screen, the movement might still be in your eye. So, we've covered attention and localization. These were the first two important functions of perception, but we have this third one. We also have to recognize the objects, not only where they are and how they move, but actually what are they. So, for example, please look at this picture. What is this? Is it a loaf of bread or a mailbox? It depends how you perceived it. That's global to local processing, especially if you have some helpers along the way. For example, you see the left or the right picture as cues. Obviously, here you would recognize this something as a mailbox, whereas here it's a loaf of bread. The image is exactly the same, but the perception is undoubtedly different. More so, if you were to see this within the picture, you wouldn't have any doubts what the object is. This is called global to local processing, which I explained in the very beginning. You have pre-assumptions of how things look like, and you get that information working when you're actually perceiving a sensory information. So, again, Gestalt psychology helps us along the way. They have these GAONs or GAONs, top-down processing mechanisms, which are very useful in how we recognize natural objects. Please read this part in the books. These are the GAONs to begin with, and then these are the complex objects that we put together from these constituents. It's also highlighting through very good experimental examples that if the GAONs are destroyed by the visionary processes, for example, some downgraded images, then it's much more difficult to recognize the object if the actual GAONs are hurt. So far, we've covered almost all basic functions in perception. We talked about attention and localization, also about recognition. We now know figure and ground. We know monocular and binocular cues for perceiving depths or distances. We also know how we see movements. We also talked a little bit about abstraction, how we take the sensory basic information and make abstract forms out of it, what we call objects. What we haven't talked about, the fifth very important function in perception, that is constancies. A closing door is a closing door, whether you see a very short angle of it or the whole door. It all depends, the sensory information all depends on, which angle you see the door from. Nonetheless, the door is a door. It's a closing door, simple as that. And our need for this kind of consistency in perception is remarkable. Let me show this to you through some very interesting and very amusing videos. Please click on the Derren Brown links given in the details of the YouTube videos, under the YouTube video. So what has happened here? Please note that the original study has been performed at Cornell University by Simmons and Levin, and in 50% of the cases, the subjects actually did realize that there was a change in the person. But in 50% of the cases, they did not. Why? Why did this happen? Well, first, very clear assumption, they didn't even look at the person who was asking for direction, but that's not true. In this second video, it's pretty clear that there was eye contact even throughout this change, which makes it really interesting. Also here, you could see a kind of glaze when the second person came in. And in the last video, I think it's remarkable that you have a change of color on the skin who is holding the map. So it's kind of obvious that there is a change. It's probably our need for constancy which allows this change blindness to be so to happen, to be so interesting. So thank you very much for listening today, and see you next time.